Today marks China's National Memorial Day for the victims of the Nanjing Massacre. 84 years ago, the invading Japanese troops captured the eastern Chinese city. A ceremony was held there in Nanjing this morning to honor the memory of the victims. Wu Bin has more.
Bells ringing, sirens wailing, China's national flag flying at half-mast. This is the 8th National Memorial Day for victims of Nanjing Massacre, and over 3,000 representatives from all walks of life stand in tribute. The Nanjing Massacre happened in 1937, when Japanese troops killed over 300,000 people in the then Chinese capital. Only 61 survivors are still alive, and that number continues to fall. They couldn't be here for the ceremony today, but their families are taking part. Nanjing Massacre is one of the most barbaric episodes of World War II. Over the past 8 years, the National Memorial Ceremony has become more than just a ceremony. It reminds people to remember the painful history in the past and also to cherish today's hard-won peace and stability. Wu Bin, CGTN, Nanjing, Jiangsu Province.
Memorial ceremonies have also been held in other cities across the country. The Northeast saw the earliest Japanese invasion in 1931. Activities were arranged at the September 18th Historical Museum in Shenyang City in Liaoning Province. Students read out eulogies, lit candles and laid flowers to remember the Nanjing Massacre victims. There were also film screenings and photo exhibitions. Services were also held in the central province of Hunan. And back in Nanjing's railway station, a wall was set up for people to write their wishes for the future, and many young people left messages expressing their love for their country and hoping for world peace. Extensive documents have shown that during the Japanese Army's 14-year occupation of China, it engaged in some of the worst crimes against humanity in history, and the Nanjing Massacre was one of them.
In 1931, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded Manchuria in China's northeast and occupied vast swaths of land there. Some 45 million casualties were recorded. The Japanese war policy: plunder, kill, and burn. And that was given full play in December 1937, when it seized the eastern city of Nanjing, the then capital of the Republic of China. According to the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal in 1947, more than 300,000 people were massacred over the course of 6 weeks. Over 200,000 women were raped, tortured, and killed. Many were forced into sex slavery. Dozens of mass graves have been discovered over the decades. In 1998, more than 60 years later, the remains of 208 people were recovered from a relatively small grave. In 2014, the Chinese government designated December 13th, the day Nanjing fell, as a national memorial day.
Relations between Japan and South Korea are at their lowest since the end of the Second World War. This is as a result of successful court cases brought against Japanese firms and the government by Koreans forced into sexual slavery and factory labor during the war. Jack Barton has more from Seoul, where attempts to ensure justice for victims of Japan's wartime abuses continue to grow.
Lee Yong-soo was forced into sexual slavery for the Japanese army at age 16. She broke down earlier this year while demanding the issue of sexual slavery during Japan's colonial-era occupation be taken to the International Court of Justice.
There is no other way now. Our government must review Japan's crimes through international law.
The issue of the so-called comfort women remains a burning topic in South Korea, which is dotted with statues honoring the victims, including one outside Japan's embassy. Tokyo claims all outstanding colonial-era issues were settled in a 1965 agreement, in which Japan paid a large sum of compensation that many credit with kickstarting the South Korean economy. The South Korean government says that agreement only covers intergovernment affairs and does not cover individual victims or their families, from seeking compensation through the courts. It's not just victims of wartime sexual slavery that have been pursuing and winning compensation cases. People forced to labor for firms like Mitsubishi have also won cases, leading to asset seizures and an unprecedented trade war between Japan and South Korea, currently experiencing their worst relations since the end of World War II.
The whole issue actually is coming from that, sad history between Japan and Korea. Japan's colonization of Korea during World War II. And that's why the issue is very deep-rooted in history.
South Korea's president has said the dispute over the historical record with Japan will not be easy to solve.
Despite our efforts, we cannot rule out the possibility that the situation will inevitably be prolonged.
The pain for the victims is very real. But there is also criticism that politicians in both countries are fanning the flames of nationalism for the sake of votes.
They use this as their political leverage. So whenever they are in a deep trouble, they want to invoke, they want to stimulate or instigate this kind of hatred among ordinary people.
Even without political agitation, the issue of colonial and wartime abuses by Japan remains an issue that won't easily go away in South Korea. And as the number of surviving victims dwindles ever lower, the memorials and organizations fighting for justice continue to grow. Jack Barton, CGTN, Seoul.
Visits by Japanese officials to a war shrine in Tokyo have long been criticized by the international community, particularly by neighboring nations. But Germany, another Axis power in World War II, has gained much credit for reflecting on its role. Gao Yiming explains.
Yasukuni Shrine, established in 1869 at the order of Emperor Meiji to commemorate those who died in service to Japan. Located in Chiyoda, central Tokyo, around 2.5 million souls are enshrined here, including some convicted of war crimes during the Second World War. In early December, about 100 Japanese lawmakers visited the shrine, including 9 junior ministers of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's cabinet. The move sparked anger and criticism from neighboring China and South Korea, who called on Japan to face up to its history of colonial invasion and demonstrate its reflection through actions.
The
Yasukuni Shrine, where 14 World War II Class A war criminals are honored, is a spiritual tool and a symbol for Japanese militarists to launch a war of aggression. The visit of Japanese political figures to the Yasukuni Shrine once again shows Japan's wrong attitude of refusing to reflect on its history of aggression.
These controversial visits to the shrine by Japanese officials have been going on for years, fueling the anger of the Japanese public and neighboring countries. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe regularly sent ritual offerings via his aide during Yasukuni spring and autumn festivals. And back in 2013, Abe made an in-person visit to the shrine during his tenure. The move triggered over 270 Japanese plaintiffs to file a lawsuit against him for fueling tensions with neighboring countries and violating the constitution. More than 360 later joined this legal battle against Abe, including those from Japan, China, and South Korea. Similar lawsuits had also been filed against past prime ministers.
We see Yasukuni as a symbol to idealize and condemn war. Having the prime minister or lawmakers visit the shrine will send a message that we do not have remorse for the past wars.
The Japanese government has often played down the nation's wartime atrocities, an attitude that has upset the victims of war and their relatives. One of the most controversial issues was the use of sex slaves. It's estimated that over 200,000 women, mostly in Asia, were forced into sexual slavery by Japanese soldiers during the World War II. But Japan has long denied such a practice. In contrast to Japan, German politicians have expressed remorse for the nation's role in the world wars. In a commemoration ceremony held by Warsaw in 2019, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier apologized for the Nazis' 1939 invasion of Poland, marking the beginning of World War II, as well as Germany's advances in the rest of Europe.
I bow my head in grief before the victims' pain. I ask for forgiveness for Germany's historical guilt, and I recognize our enduring responsibility.
And on the 75th anniversary of Nazi Germany's official surrender to Allied forces, senior German officials, including the President and former Chancellor Angela Merkel, held a commemoration in Berlin. They laid wreaths at the memorial for the victims of the war and violence.
We need to keep Europe together. We must think, feel, and act as Europeans. If we don't keep Europe together in and after this pandemic, we will prove not to be worthy of May 8th.
In Germany, the horrors of wars are remembered through monuments to the victims. In Berlin, the memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe is dedicated to the over 6 million Jews that were killed by the Nazis. The monument, made out of 2,711 concrete slabs in the center of the city, resembles a cemetery. It opened in 2005, 60 years after the end of World War II. Historians say the past must be remembered.
No one expects of later generations that they feel guilty in the view of acts that were committed long before their birth by Germans in the name of Germany. But the responsibility for your own country always includes the will to face up to the whole history of this country, and that goes for all Germans.
As Winkler says, if a country wants to look forward, perhaps it must always keep an eye on its past. Gao Yiming, CGTN.
Let's talk about this more with Professor Xia Lu from Renmin University. He joins us here in the studio. Professor Xia, good to have you with us. Now, Japanese officials have apologized in the past for their wartime atrocities, but whether it's because of wording or actions of nationalists back at home, neighbors like China, South Korea, just simply say it's just not enough. And we've seen comparisons drawn to how the German government has taken a responsibility over wartime crimes. But why is such a different attitude?
That's because the geographical situation is different in Germany and Japan, because we can see from the map that Germany had a kind of a shared border with a lot of countries, and Germany had invaded a lot of countries. So if German, the politician or statesman want to kind of cooperate or further development, it has to have a remorse, show the remorse, and it has to apologize for the wrongdoing. However, Japan is a little bit different because Japan is isolated kind of peninsula or the islands, and Japan does not connect with other countries geographically with the land. So, and also psychologically, Japanese politicians, well, they don't think they belong to Asia. They think they belong to some kind of advanced industrialized country. So they say it more like, okay, we made some kind of mistake, and we don't have to apologize for the mistake. We just in the future avoid making this kind of mistake again. So that's the kind of the mindset of the Japanese politician. It's the difference.
Well, as we see time go by, there will be fewer witnesses, fewer survivors to kind of keep the memory alive. So who's going to carry on the fight for justice for these victims?
Well, of course, it is us, because this is not the business of their own. It is not their business. It is the business of the entire humankind, because the victim and the survivors, of course, they were the immediate, direct kind of a victim of these bad things. But the entire, in a broad sense, it is a kind of crimes against the entire humankind. So for the next generation, I think we should hold kind of all the kind of this great cause in the future, because it is the humanity's kind of bad thing to humanity, not to some particular person.
And as we saw in the last report there, Yasukuni Shrine, it's very controversial for honouring the war criminals as well as Japan's war dead. The Japanese will tell you that it also bears other historical significance, and there has been attempts to kind of reinvent it as a scenic spot, right? So there's also this attitude amongst a lot of young people that this is something of the past and shouldn't be a guilt that's carried by people of today. What do you think of an attitude like this, and how this can affect the public's understanding of history?
Yes, we understand some of the people would now argue that we cannot dwell on the past forever, we should face on the future, right? But this is not about a scenic spot, this is about their wrongdoing. So the Japanese government and Japanese politicians, some of the Japanese politicians, they don't have a very proper attitudes to what they have done to the Asian people, especially for Korean people and Chinese people. So it is their wrongdoing, it is not just a scenic spot. So that's another point I would like to argue, is that the public education of history is more important for the next generation to recognize the significance of this event.
Well said. Thank you so much, Professor Jia Lu. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you.